I'm very, very excited about the speaker we have today. His name is Ian Urbina. He's an absolutely gripping and fascinating investigative reporter. I hope many of you have had the chance to read his recent investigative piece in the New Yorker, which he's going to be talking to us about in greater detail. He is also going to tell us a little bit more about the Outlaw Ocean project that he's been steering for a little while. This is a absolutely, I think you'll agree, fascinating and important topic, and we're really, really honored and privileged to have Ian Urbina with us today. Before I introduce him formally, I just want to take a moment and run through a couple of housekeeping notes. As always, I think by this point we're all pretty familiar with the Zoom webinar format, but at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. That is for your questions. We encourage you very strongly to begin asking questions at any point. You can start asking questions even now if you like. Don't feel like you need to wait till the very end to start asking questions. In fact, these things generally work a lot better when there are some questions ready to go when the speaker finishes their presentation. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A at any time. Don't be shy. Don't be afraid to be the first one. Someone needs to start. So we encourage that. I also would remind you that this event is being recorded. We hope to make it available shortly after the event itself, within the next couple of days, technology permitting. And you will all receive a link to the recording as well. I also want to remind you that the Middle East Center here at the University of Pennsylvania is a federally funded Title VI National Resource Center funded through the U.S. Department of Education. We put on dozens of public events every year. Everything we do is free and open to the public. We warmly encourage you to join our mailing list. You can send any of us an email, or you can join straight off our website, mec.sas.upenn.edu. We have a number of other events coming up this semester, and if you're in the Philadelphia area, we have most of our events for the rest of the semester are actually in person, and so we're very much looking forward to being able to do that again starting this week. I also, as part of our Title VI obligations to the federal government, we do quite a bit of regular reporting, and that includes surveys where we survey you for your satisfaction with these events. As such, I am going to drop a link right now into the chat to everybody. And this is a link to our survey that we kindly request that you take a moment to fill in. I would remind you, I hope all of you stay till the very end, but if for some reason you do have to leave early, we'd be really grateful if you just take a moment to fill in this survey. We really do care about your opinions, and they are also an important part of our reporting, and it helps us to keep all of these kinds of events going. So we do kind of emphasize that if you have a moment. With all of that out of the way, it is my tremendous honor and privilege to introduce you all today to our speaker, Ian Urbina, who is the director of the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is a nonprofit journalism organization based in Washington, although he is coming to us today from California. He doesn't like being embarrassed and being told that it's his birthday, but I'm just going to do that anyway and tell you all that he's been kind enough to join us on his birthday, where he's enjoying a little retreat in California. So we'll try to go easy on him today. But he is generally based in Washington. The Outlaw Ocean Project produces investigative stories about human rights, environment, and labor concerns on the 2/3 of the planet that are covered by water. And as part of that, he's been doing this work on Libya and the Italian coast, which he's going to tell us about. Before he founded the Outlaw Ocean Project, Ian Urbina spent roughly 17 years as a staff reporter for the New York Times. And he, during that time, has received various journalism awards, including a Pulitzer Prize, a George Polk Award, and an Emmy nomination. And several of his investigations have been turned into motion pictures. So I'm going to, without any further ado, get out of the way and hand over to our guest, Ian Rabin.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today. So my plan will be to try to limit my monologue to about half an hour. And, the overall ambition will be for me to start by telling you a little bit about the organization I run and the type of journalism we attempt to do, and why we set out specifically to do this investigation of what's happening on the Mediterranean between Libya and Italy. And then I'll sort of dive in a bit deeper to that story in particular, but I'm going to try to not assume that anyone or that most people have read the full story, but I may trip up in that and use shorthand. So I hope that folks will ask me to clarify during Q&A. So as was mentioned, I spent many years, most of my journalism career at the New York Times, and I was an investigative reporter, and my mandate was to find stories that, at some level involve things that are broken that need to be fixed on a simple level. A lot of my coverage ended up being focused on various forms of trafficking, human labor, sex trafficking. That was inadvertent, but in retrospect, I see that seems to have been a theme. The last series I did at the New York Times was a series called The Outlaw Ocean. Before I joined the New York Times, I was an anthropologist in a doctoral program at the University of Chicago, and I had spent some time at sea and became mesmerized by the sort of extra legal nature of this, kind of frontier out there, namely the high seas, and the sort of transient diaspora tribe of people, namely fishers and seafarers, roughly 50 million of them, who work out in this space, but from whom we rarely hear much, about whom we rarely read much journalism. And the space captured me, the people captured my imagination, and we wrote a series at the New York Times that sought to explore that space very anthropologically, if you will, and focus on the humans who work out there, but quite especially in an investigative way, focus on bad things happening to and around those humans. That series, The Outlaw Ocean, ran in the New York Times for about a year and a half, and then I took a 2-year leave, produced a book on it, went back out to sea for 2 more years, and then I returned to the paper and decided I wanted to stick with this line of reporting, largely because there were incredible stories yet to be done that I hadn't gotten to. So there was a wealth of targets and anemia of journalists, and that combination was unlike any other topic I'd covered. And so I thought I should just double down. So I created the Outlaw Ocean Project in sort of the spirit of ProPublica or the Marshall Project as a boutique journalism nonprofit, not an advocacy group, but nonetheless investigative in nature. We have a staff of 10, we're a 501(c), and we produce long form, highly polished, narrative investigative pieces that start out as magazine pieces aimed at sort of tier 1 venues. So the New Yorker, the New York Times, these sorts of places, the Atlantic, but that attempt to then do different things with the journalism. Number one, we self-fund the stories, and that means that we can maintain copyright over them, which means that we can translate them into 8 languages and publish them in lots of venues and avoid the exclusivity that locks them down in one venue. And that means we can have stories that get 20 million readers as opposed to 2 million readers, because we publish them in the New Yorker and Le Monde Diplomatique and Der Spiegel and the BBC and a huge variety of places. So that is one thing we do very differently. This story that we're going to talk about a little bit today was one of the 2 big blind spots that, I spent 2 years at sea producing the book, and 2 years before that at the newspaper. And there were 2 big things that I didn't touch. And it felt a bit like a personal scandal. If you're going to write about lawlessness at sea and not touch these 2 topics, you have a big blind spot. One was the crisis on the Mediterranean, and the other was the Chinese fleet. These are 2 huge stories that I just couldn't find a new way into. And that's why I didn't touch them, because I didn't think I hadn't come up with an idea of how I could do it differently or better than I had seen done before. but then I had a opportunity to I I heard from a source that the Italian government had 10,000 migrants being housed on huge cruise ships on the Mediterranean. And these so-called quarantine ships were being used to offshore migrants that had made it to Italian shores. But the Italian government was still deciding what to do with them. And under the auspices of COVID quarantining, they were putting them on these rented cruise ships and keeping them offshore. Well, that grabbed my attention, and no journalist had been on board any of these ships before. And I happened to know that the International Red Cross was administering care on these vessels, and I knew the president of the Red Cross. So the idea came to me to ask the president of the Red Cross to put me in uniform and get me onto one of the ships with a photographer, so that I could be the first journalist to sort of get an eyes onto that weird watery purgatory. That's just what we did, and we produced a story for the Atlantic just about this strange policy of putting migrants on these vessels offshore and just the conditions there. While doing that reporting, I was shocked by what I was hearing from the migrants about the refugees, about what they'd gone through, and the brutality and intensity of what I was hearing specifically about Libya, more so than Tunisia or Algeria or other places that people were launching from, grabbed me. And I thought, okay, I have to get to Libya to sort of look at this flow of humans one step upstream. So off of that Atlantic story, I doubled down on the idea that I would have a next investigative trip to Libya to really see what was going on there. There's been incredible reporting for quite some time coming out of Libya, and the brutality of that place and what's happening there is and was a very open secret. So again, the challenge was, can we do it different and better? Because what's the point of spending a year on a story unless you are really doing something distinct? In the end, I think we achieved it, but on the inbound, I'm not sure we really had a plan as to how to accomplish that. We just knew that we had finagled a way into the country, we being a team. So I took myself, the team really consisted of 5 of us. There were 3 other reporters with me, a Dutch filmmaker, female, my editor, a guy who I had hired away from ProPublica and the New York Times. He was my editor at the New York Times. He came along, and then a American photographer who lives in Italy, but he's Lebanese by descent. And we were the on-land team. So we went into Libya, and then I put a 5th person staffer of mine on a Doctors Without Borders ship that was patrolling the Mediterranean. And he was going to do a 5-week embed on a ship that was conducting rescues. And this was our reporting plan. The goal in going to Libya was, could we possibly conceptualize the tragedy of this migration flow in a more holistic way than, in my view, had been done before. The thought was, there is at the time, I was saying there might be, but now I can say more confidently, there is a orchestrated and well crafted and certainly well funded war on migration that the EU writ large, led by Italy, has been conducting for a while, that has 3 components, again, metaphorically: an Air Force, a Navy, and an Army. Let me back up and sort of be careful about the clarity of using a metaphor here. I'm not saying that the EU is engaging in a war against migrants. What I am saying is, much like the war on poverty in the US, this is a metaphor, and it is an armed government-led struggle to accomplish a goal. And the goal here in the war on migration, as I saw it, was the EU had a very decided policy of trying to stop the flow of people to European shores and stop them before they reached European shores. And Libya was the main launching pad for the bulk of those people crossing the Mediterranean. And so the war on migration was one in which the outsourcing of migration control was going to be outsourced to the country of Libya. And how that was going to be done through these three forces were, number one, the Navy, the on-water force, was going to be this strange construct, which is the Libyan Coast Guard. The Libyan Coast Guard is not like any other Coast Guard on the planet. Most Coast Guards face outward, and they're protecting the nation's shores from external threats. The Libyan Coast Guard faces inward. It's funded, trained, equipped, even given intelligence by the EU. And its mission is not to protect Libyan shores, it's to protect European shores, even though it's called the Libyan Coast Guard. And its primary goal is to patrol the Mediterranean and stop migrants from reaching Europe. So that already was a really unusual and interesting institution. And that's the on-water, the Navy, if you will, in this war on migration. In the air or Air Force in this war on migration consists of Frontex, which is the EU border agency, and it's operated largely through airplanes and drones that fly over the Mediterranean with the specific goal of spotting migrants and reporting the intelligence, namely the coordinates of where those migrant boats are, indirectly to the Libyans. Usually it goes via the Greeks or the Maltese or the Italians, and then those authorities call the Libyan Coast Guard, and the Libyan Coast Guard goes and catches the migrants before they reach Europe. So there's your Air Force. Your Army, or your on-land armed presence, is the system of brutal detention centers that exist in Libya, where all of these captured humans are then sent. And this is, again, a highly militarized force that has a larger purpose, which is to turn people back from Europe, i.e. the war on migration. So in some sense, our thought was, could we perhaps explain to the world in a broader way how all three of these components work together? They're all serving the purpose of the EU, not the purpose of the migrants themselves, refugees themselves, or even Libya for that matter. And could we do that explanatory, investigative journalism in a narrative fashion, which is to say, well, in this case, could we tell this story? Could we tell a story to explain a point? And can we tell the story through one human, one character? That was, at some level, the journalistic ambition when we went in. We had not chosen who that character would be. A week and a half prior to our arrival, a young man, 28-year-old farmer, father, husband, migrant from Guinea-Bissau, had been murdered at one of these detention centers, a detention center called Al-Mabani, which in English that's Arabic for the buildings. And it was at that point, it has since been closed because of the report we did, but was the biggest and most notorious of the prisons. And in Al-Mabani, this young man who had followed a very traditional path of desperation, leaving his failing farm and trying to make his way, as two of his brothers had successfully done before, to Europe to find work, ends up getting stuck in Libya for a while, then launches on a boat via a trafficker, is caught, halfway across the Mediterranean by the Libyan Coast Guard with help from drones and planes above, sent back to land and put in Al-Mabani. And several weeks later, a melee breaks out in the prison, and the guards open fire on the migrants, and Aliou Kande is shot in the neck and dies. And so the thought was, let's tell Aliou Conde's story, his travel, his reasons for departure, what happened to him on the water, why he got sent back, and let's piece it together in a really detailed fashion so that people can see what drives these people, and to some degree, the EU complicity in this one person's death, synecdoche for so many others who have died in much the same way. And then let's also, if we want to go really meta, make a much larger point here, which is not only is there peril both ethically and legally in what the EU is doing via this proxy force of Libya, but also this is an ominous misstep in light of the fact that most research indicates that in the next 30, 40 years, we're going to see upwards of 40, 50 million people that are going to be forcefully displaced due to the climate crisis. And so we're going to see more and more waves of desperate people attempting to reach the EU and probably trying to cross in much the same path that Aliou did. And if this is how the EU is choosing to handle that crisis, we have big problems on the way. And just on balance here, I'm an American, and it felt perilous for me to write a story of this sort that really hits the EU pretty hard when the United States is engaged in a very similar, experiment, if you will, of outsourcing the process of policing migration to a failed state. So what the US is doing in Mexico, in having Mexico serve as the housing ground for Central and South American migrants to a large degree that end up getting stopped before they reach the US border, and they're not housed in the US, i.e., therefore subject to the meddling of journalists in the US or US civil rights and human rights lawyers in the US, but rather housing them in Mexico, is the same exact thing that the EU is doing in Libya. And this is, I think, on a much higher altitude level, kind of the present method that the developed West is attempting to triage a crisis that's only going to get worse. So that's at some level the purpose of this investigation, to A, make everyone know who Aliou Conde is, B, have a more holistic and explanatory method of connecting what's happening on the water with what's happening inland in Libya and what's happening in the sky over the Mediterranean. And then also making a larger light-handed point about this challenge that we're doing a woefully poor job at handling is only going to get worse, is something we probably should have a sober conversation about now as the waves of people increase. So we went to Libya with those grand ambitions and spent a week. Ed O is an amazing photographer, videographer, spent 5 weeks on the Doctors Without Borders vessel, where a pretty high stakes life and death sort of cat and mouse game was unfolding. On the water, the cat and mouse game is distinctly bizarre in the sense that, in a very Outlaw Ocean sort of way, in the sense that you have the Libyan Coast Guard patrolling essentially the first 24 miles from shore, and very aggressively opening fire routinely on migrant boats, ramming migrant boats, outwardly threatening humanitarian workers like Doctors Without Borders, who stay on the 25th mile and beyond, just outside of this zone, which I'll explain in a second. Migrants are desperately trying to get from land to the 25th mile and get by the Libyan Coast Guard, because if they can reach the Doctors Without Borders ship, they're brought on board, and then the humanitarian workers on the Doctors Without Borders ships are doing actual rescues, as opposed to what the Libyan Coast Guard is doing, which are arrests. The rescues mean you take those people back to a port of safety. Libya is not a port of safety. The UN has designated it as not a port of safety, which is to say it is not a safe place to take people. It is a war zone. And so Doctors Without Borders takes those people to Europe. If they are instead, as they more often are, caught by the Libyan Coast Guard anywhere within the first 24 miles, then those folks are brought back to shore in what the Libyan Coast Guard calls a rescue, but any sober observer would call an arrest. And they are then put in these detention facilities to a highly uncertain fate. So this is the cat and mouse game that's happening on the water. On land, my team were in Libya in a very complicated landscape. And maybe I'll save this part for Q&A because I think we're coming towards the time. But we were there for a week. We had been given permission to be in the country as journalists. On the final day of our reporting, we had one thing left to do, which was the next morning. This was a Sunday night. On Monday morning, we had been given permission to embed, journalistically speaking, that means get on board and document, chronicle, the Libyan Coast Guard, which is unusual, but we had finagled permission and we were due to go and do that. In the prior 5 days, we had pushed the envelope, as I think good investigative journalists do. We had been told on day one that we were not allowed to leave our hotel unless with our armed security that the government had provided us, who are obviously keeping tabs on us, which is fine and par for the course. And we decided, look, we're not here to sit in a hotel for 5 days. We're going to do our job. And so we did our job, and we went to many places, including Gargaresh, which is a migrant neighborhood where all the migrants who escaped detention end up living. And we did a number of things, including we had been promised that we would be allowed access to Al-Mabani and see the conditions and inside. And then in a very typical fashion, at the 11th hour, that promise was broken. And the government said, sorry, we can't let you in. So we decided to instead go get what we thought we could get, which was visuals on the facility, which journalistically we thought was important, because if we were really going to sort of stoke the world's sense of urgency about this gulag that is existing here and the brutality that's happening behind these, barbed fences and tall walls, then we needed to have visuals of the place. So we went nearby Al-Mabani and we launched a drone. We put the drone up over Al-Mabani, and while filming, we watched exactly what so many migrants had told us during the prior week of reporting, which was, the brutality of the place, to put it mildly. And we filmed at, about 50 meters up. The guards were not aware that the drone was hovering above them. A typical ritual which had been described to us that occurs after each meal, in which all the migrants are sort of corralled into a squatting cluster, and they are not permitted to look up from the ground, ostensibly because the guards are fearful that if the migrants look around, they'll start plotting their escape route, and also sizing up the fact that the guards are outnumbered. That's our theory. But for whatever reason, there's a certain brutality in how they herd all the migrants after mealtime. And usually they beat them if anyone looks to the left or the right. And indeed, the drone captured just that, both the beating and the corralling, and then the shuttling back into their prison cells. In any case, I will end by saying, on our final night, maybe because of the drone, more likely because of a week's worth of reporting with migrants in Gargaresh and elsewhere, all of which was surveilled by the government. And we knew that we were taken hostage by the so-called Libyan Intelligence Service, which is a militia-run intelligence arm of the federally recognized, or the UN-recognized federal government in Tripoli. And we were held in a secret prison for a week until the US State Department applied enough pressure and we were released. Our crimes were twofold. One, we were journalists. We were engaged in the crime of journalism. And we were pursuing a story that was unflattering to the Libyan government. And our second crime, which is half-baked and unfounded, was supposedly we were spies. Me in particular, I was leading a CIA team there to embarrass Libya, which is patently false, I can tell you. But these were the two crimes that we were convicted of and had to sign in Arabic and at gunpoint confession documents to be allowed to be released. And this was a fairly brutal experience. I was taken from the hotel room, hooded, severely beaten, broken ribs and split spleen, and really roughed up pretty severely by a dozen armed men, and then dragged to this prison, hooded, kept there in solitary for a week, except during interrogations. And the other three on my team were taken in the middle of an intersection on their way to dinner, also by the same militia and a huge armed convoy, hooded, and taken to the same prison. All of this ends up in the 10,000 word story that the New Yorker ran. And to some degree, to even speak of what happened to us feels perilous journalistically. And there was real discussion with the team at the New Yorker as to whether we would even include our captivity in the story. Ultimately, we decided we needed to, if only because while it pales in comparison to what migrants experience in Libya. Quite literally, the average time that migrants are held in captivity is 9 months. We were held for 6 days. Many of them are raped. Almost all of them are extorted, routinely beaten. So what happened to us, as brutal as it was, and the scariest thing I've ever been through journalistically, and not the first time I've been kidnapped, was nothing in comparison to what tens of thousands of migrants are experiencing. So this was the hesitation we had in including it in the story. It might just distract from the real point of the story. On the other hand, that a team of Western journalists who had been given visas to be in the country were taken and disappeared and nearly beaten to death, that could happen to us, I think, did shed journalistic light on the arbitrary and brutal nature of detention in Libya in general, and so was relevant to the larger point we were trying to make about the illegality and inhumanity of outsourcing migration control, sort of management of ethical treatment of desperate humans to a country that's engaged in this sort of behavior. It seemed to sort of shed even starker light on that point. So that's why we included it. I'll stop there just because I think I'm at time and we can delve through more in question and answer.
Thank you very much. I think I can speak for everyone when I say that this has been absolutely inspiring and fascinating and just tremendously important for all of us to listen to. So thank you for sharing these stories and for all the work that you've been doing. We have a couple of questions beginning to come in now. And again, I remind everyone that the Q&A tab is open for questions, and please don't hesitate. Our first question comes from Dr. Eileen Ryan, who is actually a professor of history here at Temple University nearby, and actually a specialist in Italian colonialism in Libya. So it's a very historically informed question, in fact. She's asking that European nations began funding Libyan efforts to stop migrants, especially through detention centers in the desert during the Gaddafi regime. And his fall, of course, contributed to the rise in migration that we've seen across the Mediterranean. And she's wondering, do you have a sense of how EU involvement in the anti-migrant policing in Libya changed following Gaddafi's death, whether there was a sharp increase or continuity? And a secondary related question, how do the various factions in Libya think about the value of cooperation with the European Union these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's always perilous to speak in front of professors because they're bound to be far more expert than you on the topics that you work on. But quite right, the partnership, if you will call it that, which I think you should, between Europe in general and Italy in particular and Libya goes way back. And my impression is that the brutality that existed in the detention apparatus under Gaddafi was distinct, which is not to say it was a humane incarceration system that existed prior, but it had the strongman rationality of a totalitarian sort of leader who imposed certain standards on how things ran. And when Gaddafi fell or was toppled, and a void opened up in Libya, there emerged what exists now, which is a truly chaotic situation in which everything is run by their militias. And there is this falsity, I think, in a lot of the current discussion of Libya, even among UNHCR folks and various government players, as though there is a distinguishment between the federal government and militias. The very arms within the, say the Tripoli-based government, not Benghazi, are run by distinct militias. So, for example, if you on any given day in Libya, in the north, you probably have 10 to 15 officially recognized detention centers. Those numbers increase and decrease based on which militia is in favor, and that depends on who has a friend in a key position in power, which DCIM is the name of the agency within the government that handles migration control. And depending on who's running DCIM, the flow of highly lucrative migrants, refugees, captives, goes to certain detention centers because it's a hugely profitable enterprise. And so, and the neighborhoods and the detention centers are run by distinct militias. So the militia that took us, al-Nawasi runs the Libyan intelligence service. They control a certain section of the city. They also officially are anti-terrorism, anti-espionage in the government. Now, RADA, another militia, which is based not at the port, which is the al-Nawasi, but based at the airport, are their sworn enemies. Another militia that's also federally recognized and part of the intelligence apparatus, and they also have the mandate of anti-espionage, anti-terrorism, but they have a different turf. They have different parts of the city. They have different detention centers. If we had been taken by RADA, our fate would have been totally different. And we learned all this in retrospect because the negotiation that occurred when the US government found out we'd been taken, and the State Department reached out to the Libyan president, and the Libyan president reached out to the Attorney General, and then this complicated dance began to occur, negotiating our release. It became very clear, and State Department folks already knew this, all based in Tunisia, that the president can't tell the AG, the Attorney General, what to do, and the Attorney General can't tell the Libyan intelligence service what to do, because these are all factionalized entities that don't really take orders from the other guys. So there was this sort of, it was a bargaining process that had to begin. We will release these guys, but in exchange for this. All this is to say that and that's our captivity. Now, if you're a Nigerian or a Sudanese or a Guinea-Bissauan who just got picked up by the Libyan Coast Guard, where you get sent, whether you get sent to Mabani or Sana'a or one of the other centers, Al-Sika, determines which militia is actually going to be the one that's overseeing your fate. And that has something to do with who within DCIM they're plugged into. And there's a whole complicated map that's ever shifting. All that is to say, that's highly distinct from under Gaddafi. And the chaos and lack of accountability and the possibility of people disappearing and the possibility of people getting resold from militia to militia or detention center to detention center is much higher. And therefore, by my estimation, the brutality of the detention that exists now is way worse than under. But all of what the professor says is quite right, that the relationship between Italy and the desire to manage, there's this famous line, it's in the New Yorker piece, where Gaddafi was negotiating with the Italians over an aid bill, which was essentially a payoff to do this same job. And he threatened to turn Europe black. Like basically, he was going to remove the floodgates and allow all these sub-Saharan migrants to arrive unfettered if he didn't get the amount of aid. So this is a long-running financial relationship, but I think the chaos of it has gotten much more pronounced in the post-Gaddafi period.
We have a question from Barbara Romain, who teaches Arabic at Villanova, so more experts. She's asking, is there any organized protest in the EU related to this situation?
There is, like as professors know better than anyone, monoliths don't exist, right? So when I speak of the EU, or even when I speak of Italy, it's not so simple. There's incredible pushback from within the EU, from lawmakers who, long before we published, but quite especially after, have been attempting various tactics to address these crimes. And those tactics range from number one, defunding the Libyan Coast Guard, or at minimum, a more moderate stance is tying the role, because the largest and most open recipient of EU funds is the Libyan Coast Guard. And the way that supporters of that funding, both on the Libyan and the European side, defend it is to say, hey, look, all we do is we rescue them so that they're not taken advantage of by traffickers and they're not drowning at sea. They don't mention the third and I think real point, so that they're not arriving to Europe. But their claim is the Libyan Coast Guard is there serving a very important humanitarian role. The critics of it, and what happens to the migrants when they get back to shore, well, that's a different department. Take it up with them. And this is the sort of one of the goals of trying to blow the whistle on that siloization of the discussion and say, no. What the Libyan Coast Guard, if I drive you to the bank knowing you're going to rob the bank, I'm an accomplice to the crime and I will be convicted much the same. If the Libyan Coast Guard knows that they're going to be dropping people off to detention centers that are committing humanitarian, crimes against humanity, then the Libyan Coast Guard is connected with those crimes. And therefore, the funding that goes to the Libyan Coast Guard needs to take into account the on-land brutalities. So I think that many of the parliamentarians that are resisting are attempting to defund the Libyan Coast Guard, defund Frontex, which has the drones and planes that make the Libyan Coast Guard so effective, and then also put more rules on the Libyan government in terms of what they can do when they house these people. And there's a strong effort to, they're in the minority, but there is a strong effort to apply those pressure points.
Our next question comes from Professor Magali Larson, another professor. And by the way, I encourage all of you who are students and community members to feel free to ask questions as well. So we got a nice mix of questions. But Professor Larson is asking, well, she says, first of all, thank you for a frightening and enlightening talk. Can you tell us something about the roads that the migrants follow before Libya and what they do after, and if they are released 9 months later?
The roads, that was the word used? Yes. Yeah, so our reporting trip intended to follow the most common path in reverse. So our reporting trip was going to have us spend 10 days in Libya, and then we were going to head to Niger, to the northern part of Niger, and this one main road that has for over a century been the main path for a long while, legal path that many workers, many of them working in the oil fields of Libya and not intending to get to Europe, but some of them intending to get to Libya so they could launch to Europe. But there was one main path that went through Agadez, this key location in Niger, And there's this one made road that travels through the Nigerian Saharan, up to the border of Algeria if you cut one way, or Libya if you cut the other. It's the main road and always has been, because it has the most wells, water wells. And it's a perilous strip, especially further north you get, because there are a lot of bandits and other folks that will, prey upon you. It's very interesting to look at the history of what happened in Niger, because it adds further light to this war on migration, this EU-led war on migration. So the EU applied a lot of pressure on Niger to make illegal what had long been legal. These countries used to have open borders, much like the EU, and people flowed across them following market and opportunity. The EU wanted to try to stem the flow further and further upstream. And not only were they doubling down on the launching point on the coast of Tripoli, they were doubling down by providing SUVs and training and uniforms and weapons, etc., along the coast of Niger and Libya. And then they were also doubling down legislatively in Niger to make the trafficking of people, which just used to be bus drivers, right? Now these were traffickers, illegal. And overnight, the penalties for many of those folks that were carrying these transients became illegal. So we wanted to go to Niger and look at that passage and a bunch of other issues that were happening in the desert there. And then the final step, once we knew that Aliou Kandé would be the focus of our story, we wanted to make that third leap all the way back to Guinea-Bissau and to his, rural farm, his failing farm, so we could connect all the dots. But once we were taken hostage, obviously our plans changed.
We have a question now from Regina Monk, who is an editor at Commonweal Magazine. Very nice to see you again, Regina. Thanks for joining us. She says, thank you for your work. Could you say a bit more about your understanding of the high seas as a legal space? How does its lawlessness, as it were, facilitate abuses like human trafficking?
Well, you have some, you probably need a lot of time for, so that's what we've been working on. I've been working on for the last decade. And so let's see how to avoid fire hosing you. I think that, well, let's sort of, the entire outlook of my organization is that, if not the most interesting, maybe even the most descriptive element of international waters is its extra legality. That is not to say, the name of my book and the name of the organization is not the illegal ocean, it's the outlaw ocean. And the reason for that is it's making a point about extra legality. Sometimes it's illegal because there are laws that are being broken. Other times it's in the gray area where laws are not clear. But most of the time, whether there's law or something else, there's a lack of enforcement. And that is what makes this realm, in my view, distinct, unique, because laws are only as good as their enforcement, and there is no policing entity in this realm. And so whether you're talking about sea slavery or arms trafficking or the intentional dumping of oil or illegal whaling or murder on camera, all things we've investigated, the real core challenge is not that these brutalities are more common out there, but that they're more often to occur with impunity. And so that's the attempted nuanced point we hope to make. In the case, and the one thing I will add is that, by dint of the very geography of this realm, in other words, it being so huge, and being legally and governmentally outside the jurisdiction of any single government, you have these things that happen out there that no one really knows what to do about. So, for example, you have on the Mediterranean the rewriting and this is going to go down a rabbit hole, but I'll try not to stay there too long. Libya, with help from the EU and the International Maritime Organization, which is the maritime body at the UN, established what's called a search and rescue zone. It was recognized officially by the IMO, which is just to say the IMO announced it and it made it official. What it did was it established a zone along the Libyan coast that the Libyan Coast Guard could now claim it had jurisdiction over. Okay, what that means in terms of human lives is that when MSF, when Doctors Without Borders wants to actually enter a closer realm and have a better chance of picking up these people in these barely seaworthy rafts, they cannot safely get as close as they should, which is 13 miles from shore. They have to stay 25 or further from shore because the Libyan search and rescue zone has been officially recognized. Who allowed that? Why they have that authority? Does it even have any legal merit? No. I mean, you look at the actual international agreement that allows for the establishment of search and rescue zones, and you have to have certain criteria. You need a center on land that's manned 24 hours where people speak English. You need all these criteria. Were those met? No. Is there anyone out there that's going to problematize and say, wait a minute, you do not have that jurisdiction that you were given? No. Why? Because this is the high seas. And if this had been attempted on land across the border of Tunisia or Algeria or Niger, there would have been lawyers and advocates and journalists who would have jumped in and precedent. But on the water, things can happen that are harder to counteract. And that's at the core of sort of the point we often make with many of these stories about the extra legal nature of the high seas and what governments or armed players or individual actors can get away with. That's the point. And it has real life and death consequences because, Aliou Kondé would have been alive, most likely today, had the Libyan search and rescue zone not been recognized, because Doctors Without Borders would have gone to the 13-mile mark as opposed to the 90-mile mark. And he would have had a much better chance of getting to international waters and safety if they hadn't rewritten the rules with EU help. This is the point that we're trying to make.
We have a question from Mr. Nicola Gentili, who directs our cinema studies program here and was in a previous life a lawyer in Italy. He's asking, given the brutality that you just described in Libya against captured migrants, do migrants try to reach other countries like Tunisia, for example, to reach Italy or Europe? Do other countries like Tunisia use the same despicable measures against captured migrants?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Aliou Kondé, our main character, who's just a good, example to use, has one brother who, I'm not sure still how, made it to Italy, set up a whole life there, lives in Italy. Another brother who made it to Spain and set up a life there and lives in Spain. Aliou wanted to go to one of those places. He first went to Morocco and attempted to launch from Morocco to make it to Spain. When he got to Morocco, he found out that the price for a trafficking boat was double what he had, and he simply couldn't afford it. So he then made his way into Libya, where he could, for a fourth, or half the price, get on a boat and potentially make it to Italy. Lampedusa is the island of, that's part of Italy. That's the closest arrival point, less than 100 miles from Libya's coast, 24-hour trip by sea. And that's where everyone arrives, as this gentleman knows. But there are those who launch from Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, usually targeting different places. Now, the key players to bear in mind are Malta, huge role, Greece, Spain, Italy. Italy, because the vast majority of sub-Saharan and Middle Eastern migrants go through Libya because of the price and the shortness of the distance. I think 70% of those attempting to cross Mediterranean, something like that, are launching from Libya and they're aiming at Lampedusa. So Italy has been dealing with the hugest challenge of this. But Spain and Greece and Malta have also been dealing with it, and they're engaged in a similar endeavor. Malta especially is very, very much in sync with Italy and taking a similar outsourcing to the Libyan Coast Guard posture. Spain has not been as involved. Tunisia rejected EU money, which was put up a year and a half ago, but it's unclear whether they'll be able to hold the line. That was offered to them to create a Tunisian Coast Guard, same entity, same purpose. And Tunisia said, no, we don't think we want to do that. They do have their own presence on the water. They do return migrants to shore. They do incarcerate them. But the situation in Tunisia is very different. So too in Algeria, in terms of Libya being a void, of governance, and this militia-run situation where Libya is essentially three countries: the south, which is an all-out war, and then the north, which is divided between two, governments. And within each of those two sectors in the north, there are 20, 25 different militias running things. So the brutality that are encountered in Libya is not like what the incarceration is in Tunisia or Morocco or Algeria.
We have a follow-up question from Eileen Ryan, who is asking whether you can or will return to Libya anytime soon.
Not if my wife has anything to say. No, I'm very strongly banned from Libya. I won't be able to return, nor am I ready to, if I can find a way.
I have a question from an anonymous attendee who is asking if you could say a bit more about who the actual migrants are that you have been looking at, the ones going between Libya and Italy. Are they children? Are they families, single individuals? Are they mostly fleeing from war and conflict, or from environmental or economic instability?
Yeah, if you look at the demographics of migrants launching from Libya over the last 8 years, you see a shift. There were a lot more Middle Eastern migrants, Syrian, Yemeni, Egyptian migrants. Those numbers have fallen off to a large degree, though there's still, again, I don't know the percentage, but there's still good numbers of them. The overwhelming majority in the last several years have been sub-Saharan, Sudanese, Eritrean, Somali, Nigerian, Guinea-Bissau, Gambian. They're sort of, not all those are sub-Saharan, but those are the countries that were heavily represented. For example, on the, Ed O, the videographer on my staff who was on the Doctor of the Border ship, by the time they went back to port, they had 240 migrants, refugees on board, and all those countries are represented. Interestingly, there are not huge numbers, but numbers of Bangladeshis, which just blew my mind. It's like, how are Bangladeshis ending up? A lot of Bangladeshis, and to some Sri Lankans, are ending up through employment agencies getting sent to the oil fields to work as oil workers, and then they're very severely abused quite often, and they attempt to flee the oil fields and get sort of sucked into the scene in Tripoli, and then they try to escape Tripoli by jumping in a boat and crossing the Mediterranean. So on the Doctors Without Borders ship, there invariably is a small cluster of Bangladeshis that have that story.
And we have a follow-up question from Nicola Gentili, who is asking if you have had the chance to show your Libyan prison drone footage to Italian or European media, press, government entities in order to raise awareness or to draw attention to help the cause of migrants.
Yeah, so just to take 3 steps back. So one of the things that caused me to leave the New York Times, and that I had hoped to do differently, I mentioned in the beginning about sort of breaking the rules of copyright and exclusivity by self-funding the stories, largely from readers and foundations. And Libya was a perfect example of a success story of that model. So if you go, John or Ibrahim, to the website and see, there's a publish globally link on the Libya page that I can point to, and there's a map of the world for all the countries where the story ran. And that might be a good visual, but we took the story, we translated into 10 languages: Arabic, Chinese, French, German, Spanish, Dutch, etc. And we then found 1 to 2 main partners in every country. We had, I think, 4 or 5 in Italy, usually newspaper, magazine for starters, but sometimes podcasts and radio and other sorts of outlets. And then we offer the story. We have the reporting in lots of different fashions. The core story was so if you click on the Secretive Prisons link itself down, and then on that page, if you look at the top, publish globally, there's a link. Sorry, I'm pointing as if you can see me on the upper right. Yeah, so this is, if you look on the left side of the page, you see publications, and then there's also reactions. And this is where, and you see some statistics. It says news outlets 71, countries 33, languages 12. So these are all the places that ran the reporting, either in the original 10,000 word story or in a series where we gave it to them in 2,000 word parts and they ran it over multiple weeks, or the 40-minute documentary that Ed Wu produced, or shorter versions, a 5-minute, so lots of different versions. And that allowed us to get huge reach in Italy and everywhere else. And then we wrote, 8 to 10 follow-up stories, and we, were invited to present to the EU Parliament twice for big hearings about this, during which we, talked about the reporting and showed the footage and revealed our database of, proof that, EU parliamentarians were saying, no money goes towards this stuff. We had done 9 months of really deep dive digging and looking at contracts, and we had a database built that we could, pull out whenever folks would claim that. So this is where you see that reach.
Terrific. Let me see if there are any other questions. Just stop the share here. There was one more question from Nicola, who was asking, you mentioned that under Gaddafi, the situation was, so to speak, more manageable. Is there any attempt to renegotiate a deal with the current Libyan government?
There isn't a Libyan government. That's the problem. You just saw the recently, until there actually is a country that's unified in any sort of way, and I'm not advocating for a return of Gaddafi's son or anything of the sort, but until there's a functioning government, and until the militia challenge is really brought under control, there is no way to get some rationality and uniformity and standards and transparency and accountability. On the other hand, I don't want to let the EU off the hook, because there are real ways that the crimes could be minimized and pressure could be applied. I cited one of them. The Libyan government is the main players within the Tripoli-based Libyan government are very protective of the funding they get for the Libyan Coast Guard. They really like those funds, and if you wanted to apply pressure on what's happening in the detention center, then the EU could start tethering that funding to specific standards in the detention system and say, look, you can only put migrants in these 5 facilities. There have to be inspections. I mean, it's not rocket science. You would just impose conditions on those funds. Furthermore, the Libyan Coast Guard wouldn't be half as effective if Frontex and the EU were not providing the coordinates, to where to catch these folks. So if the EU wanted to minimize the capture and detention and arrest of these migrants, then they would just say, look, Frontex should not be involved in providing that intel, and they would block that. And there are a bunch of other things that could be done even without Libya getting its situation under control.
We have a question from Dimitra Sakura, who is asking, and again, I would remind you all to please put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat, but she's asking what can possibly be done? What can be done to change the situation? Will, for example, spreading information about it to the countries of origin of the migrants help?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. The way I look at this, there are short-term and long-term ways that things could improve. Long-term, big picture, let's start with those, which might feel like pie in the sky, rhetoric. But if we really want to confront these issues, then indeed, rather than dumping $500 million as the EU has in the last 10 years toward SUVs to capture migrants in the desert, or the building of detention centers, or the providing of boats, gunboats on the Mediterranean, rather than putting that level of resource towards symptoms, you could imagine a redirecting of the funding towards root causes. And what that means, again, admittedly pie in the sky sounding here, but what that means is you look at where are the push locations that most of these migrants are coming, and you start really trying to figure out how can we slow down the outflow of those people. Now, you're going up against war and poverty and climate crisis. These are big adversaries, but truth be told, unless we start looking at that, we're just going to be triaging symptoms and in poor fashion. So I think big picture, long term, you really got to look at that sort of upstream push factors. I think more immediately, the downstream factors, I think there needs to be, look, I'm a journalist, so clearly I think there's a huge benefit in supporting journalism of this sort on these sorts of spaces that are dark, and there's not enough reporting going on. So supporting this sort of journalism is one thing to do, but also supporting lawmakers who are trying to change the funding regimes that allow this to continue is another thing that people can do.
Before we wrap up and thank our speaker and let you all go, I just remind you all that I've dropped once again the link to our survey. So we would be extremely grateful if you could take a moment to fill that in. You can open it on your browser and take your time and fill it in at your leisure as we finish, after we get off this call as well. But I really have to say what an extraordinary story, what an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. I think I speak for everyone when I say this has just been really enlightening and moving and powerful stuff to listen to. It's been our privilege to listen to you, Ian, Urbina. We are grateful to all of you who've tuned in and all of you for your fantastic questions. And I hope you'll join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our speaker, Ian Urbina. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And I would remind you all as well, before you get off the call, that we have several more events coming up this week and next week. On Thursday, here in person, live here at Penn, we have Nora Erakat and Lisa Anderson. Next week, we have an event on the Iran Revolutionary Guard, and we hope to see all of you there as well. Thank you again. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.